Hey guys, I wanted to get on and basically, express something I think that's very important. I'm from the United States, and in the United States, we philosophically, I guess the Western philosophy is very much influenced by Judeo-Christian values, and especially Puritan values of delayed gratification and productivity. And Western, there's a certain kind of Western idealism about the individual, the empowerment of the individual, what the individual is capable of achieving. And there's a certain mandate that is inherent in Western philosophy that the individual is under a demand to contribute some sort of value, to generate value for society, for the ultimate good, and that there is the demand for a certain level of productivity and achievement. And you kind of have this Jordan Peterson-esque individual responsibility kind of philosophy running very rampant, I guess, in many circles these days. And this video is not so much very technical. It's only to make a general statement about the kind of repressive individual responsibility kind of Western philosophy that we all kind of are infected by, and the kinds of mandates and obligations that it imposes upon individuals, and how freedom and responsibility and all of these things end up becoming a kind of existential burden for many individuals that simply don't find themselves very adapted to Western value structures. And, I wish I could say something more substantive and technical in this video. It's only to state that, Western philosophy is, we only know we're very influenced by our environment, and there is a tendency to forget that Western philosophy is not the only, and Western philosophies are not the only options in terms of being able to select a life philosophy for oneself, and that there are Eastern philosophies that are, I believe, even better in many ways than Western philosophies. And I think the reason that many Eastern philosophies like Buddhism end up becoming a bit more intelligent and a bit more realistic than Western philosophies, the more conservative philosophies, these end up being more progressive. Buddhism sort of just is a way of coming to terms with nihilism, right? It's a way of accepting that individuals have very little control over outcomes and their ultimate fate, and that there's a certain amount of acceptance inherent in Eastern philosophy that is less apparent in Western philosophy. And in Western philosophy, there is a kind of implicit psychology of repression that is a part of the individual responsibility narrative. And maybe it's useful anthropologically, maybe it drives individuals to produce more value, maybe it makes them smarter by forcing them to do things themselves, maybe there's an argument to be made there for the anthropological value of these Western philosophies. Regardless, I think that it's important to critique them and identify their errors. And I think one such error, with your kind of Jordan Peterson-esque clean up your room kind of stuff, is that there is a repressive aspect to it. And repression, I believe, is a highly dangerous psychological phenomenon. And philosophies that promulgate repression end up limiting individuals more than they empower them, even while these philosophies allegedly, Western philosophies allegedly empower the individual. And so there's a kind of irony there, or a hypocrisy. And so, there may be an anthropological argument to be made about the value of Western individual kind of individual responsibility-based philosophies and all of that. There may be an argument there, and I'm not denying that there is. But regardless, I think that it amounts to a kind of idealism, and Western idealism is probably much worse than Eastern idealism. And the reason I prefer Eastern philosophy, I think, in many senses, is there is this attitude of acceptance of our lack of control over circumstances and outcomes. And there is an embrace of the chaos of human life and of existence. And in Western philosophy, there is this more individual empowerment kind of we control our fate narrative, where I just don't see that. I really don't see that actually necessarily being the case. And I think Eastern philosophy better comes to terms with that. Also, Eastern philosophies aren't really perverted by religious and superstitious and mystical notions. They aren't theistic, particularly. And like Christianity is, or Islam is, although that's not a Western philosophy. But there is this, regardless, I guess it's important for one to recognize that the West does not, even though it might insist that it is some sort of, it has the master philosophy, it has the optimal solution to man's, to the human condition, everything else, and it's the optimal philosophical solution, and yada yada yada. I think there's an arrogance in Western idealism, Western philosophy, that's very obvious to anyone who considers it critically, and I think that needs to be done away with. I think there is the need for perhaps not only logical consistency, but certainly more acceptance of some of the inevitable chaos of human life and the questionable nature of free will, which is very questionable. And so, in this video, I guess I'm making some pretty general, nebulous kind of discussion here. And, and that's fine. I mean, this is useful for what it's worth. And, but I titled the video, Modernity or Westernity, in the sense of we have this idea that modernity is a certain thing, and that it's technological development, it's good government, it's effective decision making, it's optimized production procedures, it's all of these great things. But this is not modernity. That's just Westernity, right? That's just in the West. We have to remember that in the East, there are very different conditions, right, depending on what you're looking at. And what people are really seeing when they attribute all those qualities to modernity, they're really just looking not at modernity, but Westernity. What's the modernity in the West? Modernity in the East, and in the Middle East, and in the East, and outside of the West is a very different thing. Modernity isn't the same for every individual culture or context. And what we're really looking at when we think that modernity is defined by this type of advancement and technological progress and quality of life and government efficiency, we're really just looking at Westernity, not at modernity. And I also, in the title of the video, mentioned the dusty edicts, right, of Western common sense, and that many of these, notions of common sense that we have in the West, how one should live life and orient ourselves, are very much, they're old, they're antiquated, they don't seem to work, hence is why I use the word dusty for them, because they're just kind of there on the upper shelf, and they don't really serve a lot of value. They're more or less a thing in the past, hence the collection of dust and all of that. I don't know. I tried to be a little bit more metaphorical with the title there. But regardless, the idea is this. Philosophy is not fixed. Knowledge is not fixed. And how we decide to look at the world and orient ourselves has not yet been decided, right? Religions may have claimed to be able to reduce human action and proper human action to rules and proverbs and metaphors and all of that. And maybe maybe they have in some ways, or at least attempted to do so. But that doesn't mean that they're right. It only means that they're popular, right? So the immediate realization of that is that it is in my power to generate the meaning that is suitable to me individually. And if there is no meaning inherently, which there probably isn't, it's my responsibility, if there is a responsibility, because there's not a responsibility in my view. There is no responsibility. Not engaging and avoiding the game of life is always an option. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? There may be even something more right about that, but not playing into a system or a game or a bunch of customs that make no sense to gain materialistic comforts that ultimately prove to be more of a burden than a benefit. And so the rat race of materialism in the West is just out of control, in my view, and doesn't really make any sense. In the East, there is a more moderate, temperate, intelligent way of looking at material. It's not as materialistic. It's just, oh, my connection is unstable. I'm going to wait for it to reconnect. Yeah. So, all that I was saying is that in the West, there's this rampant materialism that comes from the empowerment of the individual and the incentivization of the profit motive. And so this is just rampant in the West, and it's not necessarily any kind of a virtue. So the idea that I want to communicate in this video is that there is no modernity. What we know in the West is just Westernity, and we get to define what modernity is, and we get to generate our own meaning, and that there is no set, right? There's always something to contrapose any given philosophical system. There is the Western, and then there is the Eastern, there is the collectivist, there is the individualist. And so why, if these philosophies, Eastern philosophies, have been accepted and popularized in their respective domains, geographical domains and cultures, why are they not equally as valid as the philosophies that have been popularized here? And so it's only to say that philosophy is an existential philosophy, especially the question of how we should act and what we should be and what's proper action and what is good and all of that. That's very much these attempts to prescribe normatives and create ethical mandates and, enforcing a kind of logic and a kind of certain sorts of principles and yada yada. I mean, it's only to say that if popularity is not a reason to, the popularity of a system may be an indicator that the system works on some level, but it doesn't mean that it's the best system, right? So to say that, oh, well, it works, right? That's not saying anything, right? Does it? Yeah, it works good enough. And good enough often isn't good enough, right? Sometimes it needs to be better. And so, we have to try to optimize especially our existential philosophy and trying to figure out what the proper way is to act. And to remember that philosophy, especially existential philosophy, is very relative, and the West does not have any kind of primacy. They don't have a hold on what is right in terms of how to act, right? And I could point to the materialism as one fundamental problem with that. One fundamental issue with Western philosophy and the rampant kind of empowerment of the individual. And look, I mean, I'm an individualist. I do believe that individuals should be empowered to create their destiny. I just don't believe that our thinking about how individuals should act should be laced with these types of obtuse notions of that we should be responsible and act on duty and all of this. I just simply don't see that as I see that as inherently repressive. And I don't see it as a healthy way for humans to live and act. I think responsibility, the notion of responsibility, looking at it in a Marxist lens, is a very, very convenient idea to appeal to for those that want to make money off of our labor. To say, it's very easy for them to say, oh, yes, so you should be individually responsible, right? Because, yeah, that notion keeps individuals working and producing and contributing value that ultimately expands their wealth. So the concept of responsibility can be exploited by the money makers of our society and by the capitalists to persuade and induce individuals and manipulate them into working harder on their behalf to generate more value, right, for their particular corporate causes. Yeah. And so, yeah, and so I encourage individuals to be critical about philosophies of individual responsibility and to remember that there ultimately is no pressure, there is no surveillance, there is no quota, there is a right to be unproductive. And we aren't bound inherently to anyone else. That's a voluntary choice. And I know I'm making some philosophical statements here, but I do so only to illustrate that philosophy is relative. And philosophy, especially existential philosophy, is almost a process by which certainty devolves into relativity, by which knowledge devolves into relativity, by which unquestioned normative notions about how we should act and how we should think and how we should feel are brought into question and exposed to the disinfecting effects of sunlight and scrutiny. And, I just feel that being critical and being contrarian to these types of notions is ultimately way, way more valuable for where humans are now. And I view critical thinking as the ultimate error corrector, right? The identifier of an issue and the bringing of a solution to that issue. If we indoctrinate people in the idea that thinking is bad, that thinking controversial thoughts is bad, we prevent that error correcting critical thinking mechanism from doing its productive work. And so I believe in individual empowerment to the extent that we should be encouraged to be radically different in the ways that we proceed about and approach things. And there may be some disruption inherent in that type of a philosophy, that type of emphasis on critical thinking, right? It may be a disruptive thing, but ultimately the fear of questioning, right, is only a sign that what you don't want to be questioned is invalid. And, yeah. And I just, I see all of these ideas and these ideologies as very much attempts by leaders and business leaders and political leaders and those in power to keep individuals struggling on their behalf to generate value that they can then extract. And responsibility is one of these concepts, and it's just ultimately very dangerous. And I think inherent in the philosophy of individual responsibility is a kind of repression, and I think repression is an absolute negative to a certain extent. For the individual psychologically. And since individuals form the whole is composed of individuals, anything that is not conducive to individual health affects the health of the whole. And so we have to be very careful about how we prescribe, what actions, what philosophies, what ways of looking at the world we recommend to individuals to guide their action. We just have to be very careful about how we influence them in making certain ethical prescriptions. And so this is a complicated discussion, but it's only to state that the West does not have a hold on the ethical right. They do not have a hold on philosophy. They are not, if we're looking at this as some sort of intellectual Olympics, the West does not win in philosophy and any kind of education or academia. And it is not an ideal. The West is not the height of human progress as it insists it is. It is simply one iteration of human ethical organization and government organization and ethical thought and philosophy. It is only one iteration of the attempt to prescribe action to individuals and develop proper existential philosophy for individuals. It is only one. It is not the way. It is one way. It is not the path. It is one option. And so we have to remember that any given proposition, ethical proposition, can just as easily be questioned on its validity. And we have to do that rigorously and aggressively. And ultimately, in doing that, we bring new truths to light, new ethical prescriptions to light that work far better than the conventional philosophies we swim in. And, it's essential at this point, especially in this time, with the mental health issues that plague our nation in the United States. I mean, with the suicide rate and everything else, we have to question if those suicide rates, if those mental health issues if they are a manifestation of a bad philosophy being acted out by individuals. And I think it is. I think, if you look at Jordan Peterson, for example, and his health and all of his issues, his hospitalizations, his mental health issues, which I don't deride him for. Obviously, I think that he's a very competent person, a very intelligent thinker. Regardless, I think his hospitalizations and his deteriorating health, I think that's a physical manifestation of his philosophy, embodying itself in him externally. And it indicates that his philosophy doesn't work, that Western philosophy doesn't work in some way. Because if it's acted out by individuals in the way that it is, it's ultimately leading to their degradation, their degradation, their ill health, their mental problems, and everything else. We have to question whether our traditional philosophies are producing those effects. And I think it does play a part. The impulse to empower the individual, the pressure to create value at every moment, I think is a part of that. Even though we do, I believe, need to create value, we just need to do so with more acceptance and less repression. In any case, I encourage you to question Western normatives and to realize that what we think is modernity is really just Westernity. And there are other ways of looking at the world and other ways of acting. And that we are not bound to the ways of our culture, right? We have the option to transcend the norms and to find something that works better for us individually. Ultimately, that kind of individual empowerment works better, I believe. So regardless, it's only to state that, we are now probably moving beyond not to say that we are moving beyond Western idealism, but that we can move beyond it, that there may be something more ideal in more realism and less idealism, being that Western philosophy is extremely idealistic about what the individual is capable of and what they deserve and their rights. And all that's important. Individuals need to be protected, self-defend, given rights, given privileges. But at the same time, there must be a balance. Our ethical and existential philosophies of how we prescribe proper human action, these need to be thoroughly interrogated critically. And if we find errors in them, they need to be corrected so that we can develop better prescriptions for how individuals can act and view themselves and view the world. And we need to consider that modernity what we view as modernity may well just be Westernity. And that the East may have something to say about how we should act. Thank you for watching.